Alexander, I was struck by, I think, the beginning of your book. When you, like you said, you wrote this book because you didn't like a lot of the other books of
That's
the
true.
topic that you were at. Can you explain more of that? I thought that was actually pretty cool.
Let me give you an example. I was on another podcast a few weeks ago, and I'm not going to name names, but it was very apparent to me very quickly that he and I did not have a very good chemistry together. And there were a lot of things that he was throwing out there in terms of terminology that are very much within the zeitgeist of health and fitness. And he focused in on just this one point, and there was the idea of a fat burning zone. And I touch on that in my book specifically. There is no such thing as a fat burning zone. The notion is that as you and I are sitting here at rest, we're burning around 60 to 70% of fat for the purposes of making the energy that we need to stay alive. As we start to get into exercise, there's a shift away from fat towards carbohydrates. And the reason for that is because carbohydrates burn significantly faster than do fats. Okay, but at lower intensities of exercise, the percentage of energy that you're getting from fats is higher than it would be at high intensity exercise. But the point is that with exercise, you're not really interested in burning fat or carbs. You want to burn calories. You just want to expend energy at the highest rate that you possibly can. Because after the exercise is done, then you have to go through recovery. And recovery is where we're going to start to see that we have these differences in terms of the proportionate changes in what kind of fuels we're burning. And so the notion that you can hop onto a pretty core or one of these other treadmills or ellipticals and it says fat burning zone, that's just nonsense that the manufacturers put on there to make it so people will use their machines at all. And so anybody who's out of shape or doesn't really understand what it is that they're doing says fat burning zone. Oh, that sounds amazing. And I can only go like 5 steps a minute. Great. It's utter nonsense. And so what you have to do with exercise, and we'll get into that in a bit, but there's so many books out there and there's so many articles that you can read that will use this information incorrectly. And so therein lies where part of my problem comes from. And so the anecdote that I talked about in my book, this particular author, whomever it was, I don't even remember, was highly renowned within the field. Lots of people whom I was working with had read his stuff. And when I picked up his book within a chapter, I was like, this is just junk. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And that's not the first time that's happened. If you're an expert in a particular field, you will run into, just by basic consumption of the other stuff that's out there, crap. You will. I think the amount that you get within health and fitness in particular is much, much higher than it is in other fields.
That's true.
You're not going to, if you get to go to a surgeon and someone is writing a book about surgery, it's unlikely that he's going to be saying, this is all crap. This is such nonsense. But within health and fitness, you have a lot of people who are not highly educated. You have a lot of people who are certified. And in many instances, if with those certification organizations, all that's really required is a weekend in a checkbook. And then they get a piece of paper that says that they're certified to do whatever it is that that organization certifies them to do. Personal trainer, group fitness coach. Those are great for starters. In terms of actually being an expert in the field, you need to be at least have a bachelor's degree in the field, I would say. And I would argue that you need to have a higher degree, at least a master's, to really be considered an expert in the field. So after complaining about the books that I was reading time after time, and with this particular one, we were standing in line in the airport in a security check-in, and I just took the book and checked it. I put it I put it into the recycle bin. I didn't throw it away.
All right, that's good.
But my wife just was like, what are you doing? You can't just throw away a book. I was like, it's garbage. It's full of nonsense. And she said, if you think you can do better, you should try it. Well, maybe she's right.
Challenge accepted.
That's what started the whole thing.
I thought that was an interesting way to start it, actually, because I don't think a lot of people, whether it's exercise physiologists, cardiologists, whoever, people who have expertise would actually say that about another book in the beginning. I just didn't like the books that I was reading. And it felt authentic to me. Because I think a lot of people think that. They're like, what am I reading here? For instance, so there's now, maybe you've seen this, there's a tremendous amount of 2 topics that I think are become very mainstream or more mainstream with VO2 Max and protein consumption.
Okay.
And wading through these things is dangerous work, my friend. In some level. because
Yeah,
there's a lot of different camps here. But you talk about VO2 max. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that within this book and your view of that. And we'll move on to the nutritional
sure.
part next year.
VO2 max, it's a tremendously awesome measure. It's limited in what it can actually do for prediction purposes in terms of athletic performance. However, what you're basically measuring is the fitness level of the person. You don't even have to say athlete. And so what VO2 max means, just in terms of if we define that term, VO2 max, if it's not going to be the maximum, it's going to be the peak amount of oxygen that you can consume per minute during exercise. Okay. So obviously, let's just think basically the things that we need to exist, things we need to live. We need water, we need food, and we need to breathe. And what we're breathing is to bring in oxygen. And that oxygen is utilized at the end of all of our metabolic pathways to make the chemical that we use called ATP that is the energy currency for the body. All living creatures use this. Okay. So when we eat carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, we metabolize those. We break them down. We rob their chemical energy of those molecules, and we make another one that we can use throughout the body called ATP. Okay, so basically, what we're looking at with VO2 max is how much oxygen can you take in for the purposes of making ATP. Okay, and there's three components to this. So obviously, we need to have an amount of blood that's circulating through the body, carrying that oxygen to the muscles where it's being used. Okay. And so that's going to be heart rate. And then we're going to multiply that by how much blood you get out of your heart every time it beats. Okay. So if you have a big heart, which you will, if you're highly trained, you will have more blood coming out of your heart every time it beats. Okay. So that allows you to get more blood circulating around the body with each beat. So the fitter you are at each level of submaximal exercise, your heart rate's going to decrease. Even so, that goes all the way down to resting. If you're not very fit, you'll have a resting heart rate of 60 up to 100 even. If you're very fit, your heart's bigger. And so with each beat, it gets out more blood. It requires fewer beats per minute. Your resting heart rate will drop when you're at rest. The same thing is true for submaximal exercise. So those are the two primary components there. And then the third one is how much oxygen can the muscles suck out of the blood as it passes by. That too will also increase as you go through training. Okay. So how do we measure this? To directly measure it, we will strap somebody up to what's called a metabolic cart. So we'll gather the expired gases at the mouth and we'll pitch off the nose. So they're only breathing through their mouth. We know what the percentage of oxygen is in the air. It's right around 20%. And then we can measure the amount of oxygen that's left over in the gases that we breathe out. It's obviously going to be less. And the difference between those two is the amount that actually goes into the body. Okay. So as we train over time, our VO2 max is going to go up. Now it peaks in terms of how high we can get our VO2 max relatively quickly. Within a matter of months of training, you're done. That's as high as your VO2 max is going to go. Most of this is going to be genetic. Your heart can only get so big because it has so much space inside the chest. Heart rate to some degree is limited by mostly age, but also gender. Women tend to have a higher heart rate than do men because they have smaller hearts. And then the capacity for the muscle to suck that oxygen out is definitely going to be determined by genetics largely. Okay. But we can manipulate it with training or detraining. Now, when you let's say somebody has a really high VO2 max. So a really high VO2 max would be something in the high 70s to low 80s. Mils of oxygen per kilogram body. So cyclists, cross-country skiers, they're going to have these huge numbers of VO2 max. But if we take a group of, let's say, cyclists, and we rank their VO2 maxes from highest to lowest, and then we say, okay, can we use this to predict who's going to cross the finish line first? It's not a very good predictor. What we use instead, we use the next thing in line, and that's called lactate threshold. Now, this one throws everybody for a loop. Everybody gets crazy about lactate threshold. When we're doing exercise at higher intensities, we will generate a chemical called lactic acid. Now, a lot of people will call this like a byproduct. It's not a byproduct. The reason we produce it is really complex, but by and large, what it's really trying to do is buy us just a few more seconds to minutes at exercise at the highest intensity. So we're shifting one chemical, which is called pyruvic acid, to another one called lactic acid to buy us that little bit of extra time. But the more that lactic acid builds up in the muscles, it starts to inhibit our exercise intensity. and you'll start to feel it. It feels like your legs are on fire. And then as that lactic acid starts to leak out into your circulatory system, it starts to hit the receptors in your brain that tell you your blood's becoming very acidic, and you start to get this feeling like you're going to vomit or the other end. And so your ability to exercise at really high intensities before you build up lactic acid is what your lactate threshold is. Now, that lactate threshold takes much longer for you to push it further up your scale of exercise intensities than does VO2 max. So although your VO2 max will stop improving after a couple of months of training, your lactate threshold can improve and improve over years. And then that is what allows us to predict which of the athletes is actually going to cross the finish line first. When it comes to the confusion about VO2 max and what it really means, it's just a measure of aerobic fitness. That's really
Yeah,
the extent of it. Now we can use some proxy measures because you have to have some pretty expensive equipment to do a
that's right.
VO2 max test.
Mhm.
But you can predict it pretty accurately doing a number of different secondary tests. You can do a step test, you can do a sprint test, there's a whole host of tests that you can find online, and they're all pretty accurate. But that is one of those things that people get very confused about. And they also ask me, should I go ahead and get this measured? Is it going to do me any good when it comes time to actually training? And I say, it depends on what it is that you actually want to accomplish. If you're interested in competing at a relatively high level in a marathon or something of that ilk, it doesn't even have to be that long. A 5K would also be a good one. Then I say, sure, why not? Spend the money on it if you're curious to go see. But if you barely have enough money to buy the equipment you need, like a good pair of running shoes, let's say, forget about that. Just do a proxy measure for VO2 max to estimate it and then repeat that, and you'll still see you're going to get some improvements. And then you can use those numbers to help you predict where you should be running in terms of your pace or heart rate if you want to use that instead. So that's what I would say about VO2
Yeah.
max.
What you mentioned about the genetic component, I wanted to talk about that because a lot of the texts and books I've read throughout the years and my education with it, there's a lot related to the training effect, but I don't
Mhm.
see as much about the genetic effect. And then I remember going through the Harris family study, looking about VO2 max in this longitudinal study. Now, that was pretty amazing, the results and how much
Mhm.
genetics play. But in your point of view, what kind of general percentage you think does genetics play in terms of outcome of VO2 max for a person?
It's hard to say because we don't even know what genes are responsible
Mm,
for predicting VO2 max. If we think about it this way, let me just dovetail off to another topic real quick,
yeah.
and it's related though, and that's going to be muscle fiber types. Okay, so within our muscles, we have the potential for expressing three different muscle fiber types. We have type 1, we have 2A, and then we have what we call 2X. And what the characteristics of these, the type 1s are going to be more aerobic. Okay, so these are going to be the ones that we will use for not for less explosive activities and for endurance. And then type 2X, or sorry, 2A is somewhere in between. They are aerobic, but they also have a high capacity for burning carbohydrates anaerobically. And then 2X is going to be almost entirely anaerobic. So those are going to be the really powerful ones that we're going to use for big ballistic motions. Now, if you think about an Olympic weightlifter, they're going to have a much higher proportion of 2X and 2A fiber types within their muscles than they will head type 1s. Okay, so they're going to be more explosive than they will lean and endurance. And then we look at marathoners that are the exact opposite direction. But all of us have the same genes to express any one of those fiber types in our body at any time. What allows one person to have more of the 2X and 2A and another one to have more of the 1? That part we just don't know. Okay, so going back to your question about VO2 max, we still just don't really know what drives somebody to be more or have a higher VO2 max than a lower one. But again, if we look at the athletes that are involved, if we have, and again, an Olympic weightlifter, they're going to have a remarkably low VO2 max.
Right.
Okay. Particularly if we divide, if we do it relative to body mass, because they're mass, right? So if you increase the denominator of that quotient, the number goes down. If you have a marathoner, they're going to be slight in their build. Okay. And they're also, obviously now we're divided by a smaller number that makes the quotient much bigger. Their VO2 maxes are through the roof. But again, what specifically tells us which one they're going to be, we just don't know. We're still trying to work that out. What proportion of it is going to be training versus genetics that gives you a bigger VO2 max? It's going to be genetics. I'd say it's going to be like
Yeah.
90% genetics
Yeah.
because everybody can train. If a marathoner trains to be a marathoner, their VO2 max is going to skyrocket. If you get an Olympic weightlifter and try to get them to train for a marathoner, their VO2 max is going to go up, but not nearly as much.
Yeah.
And then if we go the opposite direction and we take the Olympic weightlifter and we train them in Olympic weightlifting, they're going to get much stronger. The marathoner will get stronger, but nothing compared to what they're going to see with the Olympic weightlifter, even if they're in the same weight class. So what proportion? It's got to be a huge number, but I don't know, and no one else does either. That's a mystery that we're still trying to work out, and I hope one day we get to find out.
That would be great too, but I don't know is also a good answer. I think
Mhm.
sometimes we try to have all the answers, but I don't know is a real authentic answer. Now, switching to staying on VO2 max, but looking at kind of general population, what are your thoughts about VO2 max and all cause mortality related to that?
Oh, there's a direct inverse correlation. So if the higher your VO2 max, the lower the rate of your all cause mortality for sure. And that just makes perfect sense. If
Right.
you're fit, it's less likely that you're going to die of a heart attack, cancer, a stroke, any one of those normal morbidities that we would see with an aging process or just living a poor lifestyle. Now, is it really the fitness that's doing it? So is it the fact that you have a VO2 max that's high? Probably not. It's what's very likely that it's the fact that you do more exercise, but what other characteristics in your lifestyle are going to come along with having a high VO2 max? You're probably going to not drink as much. You're probably not going to eat crappy foods. You're probably going to sleep better, and you're probably going to have less stress in your life overall than someone who's a couch potato or sits at their desk plugging away all day. So it's not only going to be the fact that you have a higher VO2 max and you're more aerobically fit. It's all the other characteristics that can come combined in that lifestyle that are going to follow along with it. But it is absolutely a good predictor of all cause mortality.
Most definitely. Switching gears, obviously you talk about nutrition in your book, and a lot of my clients recently have been told by their physicians that they need to have more protein as they age.
Mhm.
I would love for us to discuss that a little bit because I think there's a lot of discussion out there in the internet, the sphere of influence about this. Tell me your thoughts, feelings, research related to this.
I love protein, period.
Yeah.
So that's the short answer. Let me give you the longer answer. So in my book, I talk about, there was a researcher, and it's Florida Gulf Coast University. That's where he is. His area of study was to see just how much protein we can actually consume. What's the primary concern that we hear about from trainers and doctors and all sorts of people about taking in additional protein above and beyond what is recommended? Is that it's going to cause liver and kidney stress, if not damage. So he was trying to see, just let's test that. Let's see how much protein we can stuff into these particular athletes. Now, these were mostly body, and I think they had a couple of Olympic weightlifters in there as well. So individuals who were interested in having additional muscle mass added on. And they would take in protein in any fashion that they could think of because they were taking in many grams. So let's go ahead and think about the idea of what the normal amount that a normal human should take in per day is 0.7 grams per kilogram of body weight. Okay. An athlete should be somewhere around 1 to maybe 1.2 in that range. The question he was asking, can we bump this up to 2? Can we bump it up to 3? Could we bump it up to 4 or 5? And he would put this through what's called an IRB. So this is an internal review board. So these are the professors at your university who are there for the purposes of protecting human subjects in any research test. So they would immediately reject his application for an IRB and say, this is just too much protein. You're going to cause liver damage. So where's the literature to back up this claim? We're testing this idea. And there is no literature to say that. This is all just wives' tales because it's an assumption based on the idea that when we actually metabolize proteins for the purposes of making ATP, we have to remove the amine group off of the amino acid. That is going to be coming out in our urine as effectively urea and ammonia. And the removal of that takes place in the liver. So those are the two organs that we have that have to be present and functional for the purposes of metabolizing protein. So what he finally compromised with the IRB was that they would do a step test slowly going up and they would continuously monitor liver and kidney function. They got all the way up to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight, a massive number, to the point where the test subjects were struggling to get in that amount of protein. That's just so much food in a day, and specifically protein. And at no point did they see any signs in any of those tests that would reveal that there was any type of stress on either one of those tissues. So I don't know that you necessarily have to take in that amount, but you can if you were to need to. Why is this important? You're talking about an elderly individual. As we get older, we lose muscle mass. Even if we're exercising, we're still going to lose some. Why that specifically happens, we're not entirely sure. But there is a process called sarcopenia, which is basically age-relating muscle leaning out or loss. It can be really bad in individuals who are inactive. But since it's a natural process that's going to happen anyway, what our general inclination is to think about is that we're not able to metabolize these proteins as well. So the amount that we do take in, a good portion of it comes out in our feces. So until we figure out exactly what's happening, then what we need to do is take an additional protein to get in the same amount that we were getting before into the body. And then we can still lose that amount that we're losing in our feces and be okay. And so there's a lot of research being done in older individuals that's diet related, specifically manipulating the amount of each of the three macronutrients that we have. The macronutrients obviously being carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Now we need all of them. We need all three of those, have to have them. Now you can have protein that there's really only one flavor of protein and you're going to get all 20 amino acids in that protein. Carbohydrates, there's a number of different types of carbohydrates that we can take in. And they range from simple sugars to more complex carbohydrates, all the way up to starches and fiber, which we can't digest. And then with fat, it's very much similar to what we have with carbohydrates. There's a number of different kinds. They vary in the length of the fatty acid chain. They vary in the types of bonds that are within that fatty acid chain. So you can have unsaturated fatty acids, which are the ones that tend to be solid at room temperature. And then you can have, I got that backwards. That would be a saturated fatty acid is one that we have that's going to be a solid at room temperature. And then we can have a number of different kinds of polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fatty acids. And these are the ones that we think of as being healthier because they tend to be liquids at room temperature. But back to the idea of proteins, these studies have been going on quite well. And even if we don't have exercise included, we still see that there is an improvement in the amount of muscle mass that's retained as we age along. What really kickstarts that over the top is when we combine manipulation of the diet with exercise and specifically resistance training. Resistance, there's lots of people who just do not like the idea of doing resistance training, particularly women. When you talk to them, you're like, I don't want to get bulky. Well, you're not going to get bulky unless you're intending to get bulky. But what you will do is you'll have much more definition within the muscles that you do have. And you will shed off some of the fat that's around them so that you can actually see them better. There's plenty of evidence that when you do weight training appropriately and effectively, you actually lean down quite a bit. And you have to do a very different kind of weight training to actually get bulk and mass added on. So with older folks, we have the idea of sarcopenia, which is loss of muscle mass. But because a lot of these folks tend to not be very active, the other issue that we have, and this is the big danger, is that they also start to lose bone mass.
Yeah.
And bone mass is or loss of bone mass is one of the key predictors to long cause mortality, particularly if you have a fall. Falls tend to lead to fractures, and the one we're most scared of is hip fracture. The 1 year post mortem after hip fracture, depending on the age of the individual, can sometimes be as high as 60%.
Yeah.
So what that means is if you fall and you break a hip within 1 year, you're dead. So what we obviously want to do is prevent those falls from happening in the first place. But if someone is to fall, we want their bones to be resilient enough that they don't fracture. So along with this bone, there's a lot of protein in bone. And so if you're going to be combining a resistance training program, which is going to strengthen the muscles, it will also strengthen the bones. And we also want those bones to have enough protein present that they can produce the collagen fibers, which actually make the tensile strength of the bones better. So that's the whole story of the combination of those things. Now, how much protein can an older person take in? I've never seen that there's a particular limit. And I would be stunned if anybody above the age of 50 could have enough hours in the day to consume enough food that they would take in protein in the amounts that it would be dangerous for them moving forward. That said, I am not a medical professional. I'm a PhD. Always check out with your medical doctor before you start any type of new regimen, whether it's exercise or diet.
Most definitely. I want to go back to the bone mineral density, especially.
Please.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between your ability to increase the amount of bone mineral density as a younger, much younger person, let's say teenager, early 20s versus someone who is a senior citizen?
Sure. So part of this is going to be hormonal. The hormones that younger individuals have in higher quantities drives the production of new bone and the remodeling of that bone. So let me define what remodeling means. As we're going through gestation in the womb, we're turning cartilage into bone. That's bone modeling. That's making the bone the first time. And the analogy that I put in my book is think of your house. Once the house is built from scratch, that's bone modeling. Thereafter, if you get a crack in your wall, you have to fix that crack. That's bone remodeling. Okay. So part of it's going to be hormone, part of it's going to be diet, and then the other big part of it's going to be exercise. In order for bones to maintain their bone mineral density, they have to be subjected to stress. And what we call that stress is load. And really what that means is the effect of gravity on the bones. Now, what exactly the signals are in terms of how we express that load, we don't entirely know. But what we do know is that when bones are unloaded, they do a much poorer job of maintaining their strength. Basically, the way to think about this is if you don't lose it, if you don't use it, you're going to lose. Okay. Bones and any other tissue are metabolically expensive to maintain. So if they're not getting the appropriate signals that we need to maintain the mass that we have, then we'll start to lose a portion of that bone mineral. The opposite is true as well. The more load we put on our bones, the stronger they're going to get over time, just like muscles. Okay. So a good portion of this is also just going to be exercise as we move along. Now, let's think about which bones we have the most issues with. As I mentioned, hip fractures are a big concern. So it's really lower body. Upper body, we don't have many breaks up here. And part of the reason why is that even if you sit every day of your life in a chair, you're still using your arms to do something. So there's load associated with that. It's the lower body that's going to be the issue. And so we have to get people to get up and move around, even if it's not going to be high intensity exercise, although I would say that's really important. They need to actually walk. If they can run, all the better. If they can do some form of resistance training, it even just be body weight, just doing step ups. Those things will help to increase the amount of load on the bone to maintain it over time. And then, of course, we talked about the other issues in terms of diet as well.
Yeah, I think it's just an interesting topic because I think we don't discuss bone mineral density enough in a mainstream thing. We talk about the chronic and acute adaptations to strength training and stuff. So it was good to drive home that point that bones are a big part of it. It has to be a discussion. So I want to segue into also the high intensity interval training, which you just mentioned, which you talk about in your book. And I love because I'm a huge proponent of this, huge
Mhm.
proponent. But I also think there's something else going on too that I've seen in terms of this is purely observational data that I have for it. Let me put a disclaimer, but I'm seeing a lot of steady state based aerobic activity these
Mhm.
days, primarily, and not a lot actually of people really stressing their cardiorespiratory system. Talk about the importance of really stressing that system and why it's really almost a very superior version of doing that.
It is. And there's a number of reasons why. But I think the first one, the most practical one, is that you can pack in a 3 hour workout at low intensity into a 30-minute workout at high
Right.
intensity and get the same benefits, if not even more. Now, it depends. Again, we're going back to the same idea. It depends on population that's in question. If we have athletes that are training for a specific events, if you got a marathoner or ultra marathoner, they got to do long distance runs because that is the event that they're training for. But even with those athletes, I'd still throw in some sprint sets because they need to have those too. But if we're talking about your average Joe who is just trying to stay fit, leave the long distance runs behind unless you enjoy those. If you enjoy them, go do them. But if you don't have time on a Sunday to go out for 3 or 4 hours, then let's do a HIIT training session instead and pack that in there to get the same benefit. Now, the question is, why is it that these high intensity interval training sessions are better physiologically, which is what the book is all about? In what we think is happening here is that we have two things. One, we have carbon dioxide is building up in the blood in much higher proportions or quantities than it would at low intensity exercise. And then 2, lactic acid. Okay. That's another thing that's going to build up in the blood during the HIIT session that you're not really going to do during a low intensity session. Those 2 chemicals are potent stimulators of the aerobic system to make it adapt and get stronger. Okay. And better. You have a higher aerobic capacity after doing HIIT training than you would just endurance training. And the science behind this has been around for a long time. So Tabata's study was in 96. So we're talking 30 years that this thing has been around. This is not new information, but there's a whole lot of resistance to the idea for a number of reasons. It doesn't feel good to do HIIT if you're not used to it. It feels bad. It feels
That's
really
right.
bad. And it can be intimidating for people to do HIIT if they're not used to it. So if you don't want to do it, then go and put in that other time. It's better than nothing. But what we're talking about here is which of these modalities is the best in terms of training your body, and not just for the aerobic capacity, but also for the additional physiological benefits of preventing heart disease, preventing respiratory disease, preventing bone mineral density loss, etc. All these things are going to be better with HIIT because the load that you put on the muscles and the bones is going to be higher. The stress that you put on your respiratory system is going to be higher. And in addition to that, that you're exposing the brain to much higher levels of neurotransmitter release, which allows your brain to calm down more after the exercise is done. So why are we shifting back away from HIITs now? It's been cool for a couple of years. And now we're going to go off and do this other thing. It's cyclical. It just comes back around. I think that for myself, I love doing HIITs, but I also like to go for a really long bike ride or a really long open water swim because that's my time to just zen out and be there. When I'm doing a HIIT training, I got to be on. I'm thinking what I'm doing right there and then. I cannot let my mind wander because something's going to go wrong. I don't think there's any particular danger in letting people do what it is they wish. But what my point of view is, I want to educate you on the most efficient form of exercise you can potentially do. And there is no age limit in terms of who can and cannot do HIIT training. We just have to modify it a little bit to specify it to your needs and limitations, but everybody can do it.
Yeah, and there's a variety of different modalities that you can use
Sure.
to facilitate this, which is wonderful about that. Whereas if you're trying to do something steady state, let's say the rower, is very difficult to do the rower for a really long time. Efficiency, you have to be really efficient and have great technique to do it for that. So HIIT, you can do almost anything
Sure.
and create a session with that, which is beautiful. I want to
You
talk
don't need
also a little
any equipment. You don't need
any
any equipment at
right,
all. You
literally.
can do it barefoot naked if you want to. I
That's
mean,
right.
all you have to do is you just have to do something that's going to get your heart rate up and keep it up.
That's exactly right. I would love for you to add on to this and talk about the role of excess post oxygen consumption and related to HIIT as well
Sure.
as another benefit related to it.
So let's think of ourselves as being on a treadmill. We're standing on a treadmill and it's not moving yet, and we're about to start exercise. Okay. And this is a pretty highly trained individual who's not going to be anticipating the start of the exercise. They're just going to be standing there chilling. Okay. As soon as we start that run, their body has not gotten into a position where it's delivering an adequate amount of oxygen to the muscles to supply the oxygen that's necessary to get to steady state exercise. It takes a little while to get there. Okay. And during that time, we're going to be relying on other energy systems to provide the gap between our oxidative systems and then our oxygen demand. So we're going to be producing a little bit of lactic acid. We'll be producing quite a bit of CO2 that's going to be staying in the blood, et cetera. Okay. So in other words, then the way that we look at this is your heart rate. So you're standing on the treadmill and your heart's at about 60 beats per minute. And then I hit go and I make you start sprinting right off the bat. Okay. Where your heart rate should be at that particular intensity of exercise is at about 120, but it's not there yet. It's going to take some time to get there. Your respiratory rate should be at about 60 breaths per minute, and it's not there yet. It's only at about 40. And it's not going to just jump up to 60. It's going to take some time to get there. The exact opposite is true when we get to the end of the exercise. Okay. So we got this person to steady state exercise. Their oxygen demand is exactly the same as their oxygen consumption. Now, at the end of exercise, we hit stop and we come to a crashing halt and they're just standing there. But they're not going to go right back down to their resting heart rate immediately. And their respiratory rate's not going to go right back down to where it was immediately. It's going to take some time. Okay. And what was thought initially was that the amount of oxygen debt that we built up at the beginning of exercise should match the amount of additional oxygen consumption we have at the end of exercise. They don't match. There is quite a bit more extra oxygen consumption that takes place at the end of exercise during recovery than the debt that we built up at the beginning. So what is that doing? That additional oxygen that we're taking in is there for the purposes of helping us recover. Okay, so we have our parasympathetic nervous system is kicking in, it's slowing down our heart rate, it's slowing down our respiratory rate, it's bringing us back down to our calm state where we can eat again. Okay. The higher that amount of post-exercise oxygen consumption, the better, because that's also during the time when we're going to be burning more fats than carbohydrates, which is ideal. Okay. Which means that during your recovery after a very high intensity exercise, you have a much higher EPOC, so excess post-oxygen consumption, than you would if it were a lower intensity steady state exercise. And not just that. So once you get down to the point where you're now breathing at a more normal rate, you think, okay, I've recovered completely. That would probably happen within a matter of 20 to 30 minutes, really, maybe a little bit longer, depending on your fitness level. But the actual amount of oxygen that you're taking out of your blood still remains elevated for a few hours afterwards. And during that time, we're still going through recovery. And the energy that we're going to be tipping into to actually go through that recovery phase is going to be provided largely by fats. So what we want is for the EPOC, the excess post-oxygen consumption, to be high and for as long a period of time as possible. Those are both increased if we do HIIT versus endurance training. Okay. So again, we're going back to this idea of the fat burning zone. No such thing. Where you're going to burn fats during high intensity exercise or in relation to a high intensity exercise session is after the workout's done. Okay? And that's what we want to see. Okay. So that's where that idea comes in. Now, that said, I put this in my book. Some people who are proponents of HIIT will tell you that it goes on for hours and hours and it's amazing. It's really not that much more than you would get from endurance training, but it's still enough to make a difference. It's 10 to 15%. And in physiological terms, 10 to 15%, it's pretty big number.
Yeah, that is actually pretty large number thinking about that. I wanted to move into you. It's in there on here about the Hadza, and this is really interesting information and something that also I've seen in Dr. Daniel Lieberman's book, Exercised, about the study of the Hadza. Give some background a little bit about the population of people so people know what we're talking about here. And then also what the observation of this group of people related to exercise, nutrition, and all the above.
Sure. So I saw this study and it was on maybe World News Tonight or something, but they did a brief story on it. And I found it fascinating. So I grabbed the paper and it's one of my favorite papers. There's a lot of scientific papers that go on 3 pages long. This one was like 3 pages, and so you could get through it quick. And the message was short and punchy. You got right to the point. And it was written in a language, and I don't mean English, just in a terminology that was very user-friendly to a lay audience. So it was a great study. So the Hadza, Hadza, this is what we would call as close to a Paleolithic type hunter-gatherer tribe as you're going to find anymore. They live in Tanzania. And they have a division of labor where the women and children are largely gatherers, and the men are almost entirely going to be hunters. Okay. So they walk for miles a day. I think the men go up to 7 miles a day. The women are around 3. But even with that, once they find the thing that they're foraging for, in many instances, they have to dig up tubers. So that takes quite a bit of energy. The men will either walk or they'll jog at a very slow pace for hours at a time, wearing out their prey until they can kill them. Okay. Their diet is seasonal because obviously they don't have a grocery store. So they're eating what nature is giving them. And so it rotates around. And so there's some science that states that eating a rotation of foods throughout a seasonal diet is better than having things that are available to you year round. But the 2 big things that we get from the Hadza tribe and other Paleolithic tribe is looking at their total energy expenditure, their physical activity level, and then their base metabolic rate. So let's define all these things. Physical activity level makes perfect sense. It's how much extra energy do you burn every day above and beyond what you need to live doing your activities. Okay. The base metabolic rate is just how much energy do you need to stay alive. So if we lay you flat down on your back and all we let you do is breathe, and that's it, you burn X calories. Okay. When we combine those two, we get a total energy expenditure. So this group of researchers went to Tanzania, and they're not going to bring a treadmill or a metabolic cart with them. So what they did was they used what's called doubly labeled water, which they could then use to determine what their aerobic capacity is and how many calories they burned. What they noticed pretty quickly was that they burn, see, I'm looking at my book right now in terms of total energy expenditure. They burn more calories per day than do Westerners who are doing the same thing, okay, who are having the same experiments done on them. But it's proportionate to their body mass, okay? If you have somebody who's sitting at a desk all day long, they're going to be heavier than their Hadza counterparts. They tend to have a higher base metabolic rate because they have more tissue presence and they're going to burn more calories. But if you divide that by their total body mass, the Hadza way outpaced.
Yeah.
Okay. So they have a higher base metabolic rate. They do more physical activity every single day. And then they have a diet that's entirely different from ours.
Yeah.
Okay. So the idea from this is that if you lead a sedentary lifestyle, you're going to put on more mass, and that's going to drive up your base metabolic rate quite a bit in your total energy expenditure because we have just so much more stuff. So if you've ever heard somebody say, I'm not making aversions to anybody who's fat or obese in any way, shape, or form, but if we see somebody, and I've talked to a lot of people who are overweight and obese, they say, my metabolism is just so slow. Not entirely true.
Yeah.
All that additional mass that they have, all that additional tissue requires a much bigger metabolism. So their metabolism overall is way more than someone who's smaller than them. But if we divide that by body mass, then the smaller individual is going to have a higher metabolic rate per unit mass than the bigger person. Okay. So the key part of that particular study was to debunk this whole idea that they have these metabolisms that are just through the roof. Their
Right.
metabolic rates were either the exact same or slightly lower than the more overweight and obese Westerners who had the crappy diets and the sedentary lifestyle. Now, I go into this in the book as well. If we look at, and that's why I had the title of the book being Exercise Ain't Enough. What I mean is exercise ain't enough to lose weight.
That's
If
correct.
you're not
Yeah.
going to change your diet, exercise alone is not going to do squat.
Exactly.
And I can tell you the reason why is that we take in so many more calories in a Western diet than we ever possibly should. And then in addition to that, when we have people who are coming off the street and saying, I want to start a new workout routine, they're really diligent about their workouts, but then they fall off the wagon when it comes to their diet. And it's called reward feeding. So I've already got a bad diet, but now I just got through this horrendously heavy, awful workout. And I'm so proud of myself. I'm going to reward myself with an extra scoop of ice cream. Well, you just undid everything you just did in an exercise session. Because you just took in twice as many calories in that extra scoop of ice cream than the calories you burned during your exercise session.
Yeah.
So the mantra to the story here is that diet always trumps exercise when it comes to weight loss. So we go through the idea of the Hadza and their daily activity level, which is extremely important, but not so much because for their weight loss or weight maintenance, but for all the other physiological benefits that are brought into effect by doing exercise. But when it comes to maintaining their lower weight, it's all about the diet.
Right.
So they're eating raw food. Okay. And what do we mean by raw? Raw is anything that's not processed. And what does processing means? It means anything that you do to that food to make it easier for you to digest. So if I take an apple in the morning and I cut off a slice of it and I eat that slice only, that's processing. Okay. Now it's not very much processing, but it's still processing. Okay. So we eat foods largely in a Western diet that have been processed to the hilt. Okay. They're so processed. And that means that we're adding in all these additional ingredients that we really don't need. And that is additional calories that we don't need. On the other side, we look at individuals here and they're eating stuff that they're picking right off the tree, popping their mouth, they eat it. Now their body has to expend quite a bit of energy to actually process that food. They've got to chew it. They've got to swallow it. They've got to digest it in the stomach, then in the small intestine, then they have to absorb it. That process is called the thermic effect of food. Some foods have higher thermic effect of foods than others, but there's not one of them that you get a free lunch. So even if you eat an all celery diet, you're still going to be absorbing some calories from that food that you take in. Now, In addition to the fact that they have all these raw foods, they're going to eat meat that they're going to get from the animals that they hunt, but they're not going to get nearly as much as we consume. We eat way more animal protein and animal products than they do, because theirs are going to be seasonal again. The other thing that's interesting in terms of the meats that they eat is that they don't just eat the muscle. They eat organ meats, which are really important to a lot of these diets. And what do I mean by organ meats? Liver, intestines, kidney, brain, tongue, eyes, testicles, the whole animal. And this is not something that's only seen within Paleolithic tribes. Okay. We also see this within cultures where there tends to be a lot more poverty. So my mother came from Venezuela. My father came from Scotland. And on both sides of that family, I was fed things my friends were, I can't believe you eat that. So much so that we have something called black pudding in Scotland.
Yeah.
You take a casing, you stuff it with oats, and then you take the blood of the sheep or the cow and you pour it into that. So you're eating blood sausage, literally blood sausage. But if you don't have a lot of money, you're going to eat every last bit of that animal. Another part that's really important, marrow is highly nutritious. Marrow is one of my daughter's favorite things to eat when we go out to a restaurant, if they're a restaurant that will serve it. And so there's great things there. The last thing that I will say is this about these folks. The primary difference that I noticed when I was going through their consumption of food versus ours is that the huge quantities of fiber that they will take in. And they're not taking it in because they're thinking about it. They're taking it in because they're eating foods that are high in fiber. So what does fiber mean? There's two different kinds of fiber. We have soluble fiber, which we can't digest directly, but we have bacteria in our gut that can. And they break this down and they make certain chemicals that are very good for our gut health. Butyrate being one of them. It's a fatty acid. And then you have insoluble fiber, which you can't digest at all in another kind of bacteria. And that's what gives us bulk in our feces. And that's what allows us to reduce the transit time of our food through our colon. So let's think of it this way. If you take in a meal that has very low fiber, it's going to stay in your colon for a very, very long time. The longer that transit time is there, or the longer the transit time, the higher the risk for developing things like colorectal cancer. Okay, so you want to have a very high fiber intake. Now, the Hadza are taking in on the order of 60 grams a day. We're taking in 2 to 3. It's just a paltry sum of fiber. And it's not even like it's hard.
It's not
You have
hard.
to eat things,
No.
the skins of fruits. So apples, great in fiber. Long whole grains have plenty of fiber in them. Any of the sweet potatoes, packed with fiber. Those are the kinds of things, green leafy vegetables, packed with fiber. So there's where you have to make your change. Those are the things that you have to do to actually try to bring down your weight. You have to decrease the total number of calories taken per day completely. You should be, men should be around 2,000 calories a day, women maybe 1,800, maybe 1,600. Right now, we're double that on the average in America. And so it's no wonder that we pack on these additional pounds. Now, so that's the last I'll talk about that part in terms of the diet, but let's focus on one more thing. And there's a lot of guilt associated with being overweight and having a poor diet. And I think that's not a bad thing necessarily, because guilt and shame can be a very good driver in terms of getting you to motivated to do things, unless you have too much of it and then it just shuts you down emotionally completely. So we don't want to get to the point where we're just shutting people down. A little bit of motivation is a good thing. When we really think about it, people shouldn't necessarily be depressed or feeling guilty about the fact that they're overweight. Our bodies are doing exactly what they're designed to do by getting overweight and obese. If we think about the kind, where we came from evolutionarily, we've only been around for a couple, maybe 100,000 years, our specific species in our way. We can track it back a little bit further, maybe down to about 3 million years if we get to Lucy and those people in the Horn, not the Horn of Africa, but I can't remember which was Ethiopia area of Africa. Evolutionarily, we are a feast or famine species. So we go for long periods of time when there's not food available, that we will live off the stores that we have in our body to keep us alive. And then when there is the abundance of food present, we're going to gorge and pack on all the food that we possibly can to make us a little bit fatter to make it through the lean times. The problem is, in America and all Western countries, there are no lean times.
No lean
There's
time.
always food available. There's always copious amounts of food available. And so we don't ever go through a famine stage within our cyclical path in a year. We're always eating. And so it takes remarkable amounts of discipline to
Right.
eat less and eat the right things. The right things tend to not taste very good because they have lower caloric content. It's true.
Right. True. Yeah.
But again, let's think about evolution. Well, our prime directive is to stay alive long enough to mate and produce progeny. And so what we're geared towards evolutionarily are things that taste remarkably good. And they taste that good because they're packed with calories and they're going to keep us alive. But when we get to this stage, now it's the exact opposite. Now those are liabilities. So all those foods that are so delicious are the ones that are killing us as a
Yeah.
nation and as a species. So get rid of the guilt. Stop beating yourself up over the fact that you are overweight and obese and do something about it. But know that it's not necessarily your fault. This is your genetic
Right.
code. And it's true for all of us. Now, some people will be leaner than others and can eat a whole lot. Those people, if we lived in feast or famine times, would be the first ones to die.
Correct.
If the rest of us who have a difficult time keeping mass off, who would be the survivors if we were in a feast or famine situation again?
Yeah. And you mentioned also too, I believe in the book, and this is definitely part of the Hadza. If they were transplanted into our standard kind of American cultural diet, they would also gain quite a bit of weight as well. It's not like they're special in terms of
They're
that.
not.
It's their environments where they're at.
Exactly.
It's very much based off of that. Not that there's a special capability that they have
Sure.
for
Their
that.
genetic code is going to be 99% the same as ours. It's all about the environment that you put yourself
Correct.
in. Okay. Or
Right.
that not you put yourself in, but that you are in. Now,
That you are
you
in.
can
Yes.
choose to change your environment, but it's akin to being a drug addict or an alcoholic or a compulsive gambler or
Yeah.
whatever else you have that you have a compulsion for. If you keep those same things around you, you're going to do those same things.
Right. Right.
So if you want to lose weight, you cannot have a pantry full of crap. You have to get that thing
Correct.
changed. If you this is going to sound pretty harsh, but if your entire peer group is doing those same old activities and you want to leave that, you're going to have to limit your exposure to that peer group. You just have to. Don't be around them during meal times. Be around them during other times. But the same thing is going to be true if you're a drug addict or an alcoholic. If your friends are still living that same lifestyle and you want to kick that habit, you cannot be around those people doing those things. You can't. So it all comes down to willpower, and it all comes down to sucking some willpower off of some other people who can give you some of theirs to give you direction and confines in terms of your behavior.
Yeah. And adding on to the metabolism part is we've had some pretty good data in the last few years that metabolism really alters dramatically in your 60s, more dramatically versus this in the past. You've thought about it in, your late 30s, 40s, just and this, my metabolism is so slow. Really not that significant until you get much older for
I
that.
don't even know if it changes tremendously as you get that
It's
much
not
older.
even that
What
big.
changes
It's a
is your
small
behavior.
percentage. Yeah, your behavior. And you have this inverse relationship too of your activity levels and your nutrition levels as you age, they start passing each other.
Mhm.
One going down, the other going up for that.
Sure. You know,
And
as you get into your
that's part
retirement,
of it.
you're in your golden years.
Yeah.
You can eat whatever you want now. And
Yeah.
people do. And they end up
They
kicking the
definitely
bucket a
do.
lot sooner than they would otherwise. But yeah, you're right. Let's think about this. When the initial idea in terms of when you started to have a slower metabolism putting on mass was mid 20s to 30s.
Yeah.
So what's changed? You have spent the entire time up to that point being in school. Okay. And just the nature of being in school, we're going to go from this class to this class to this class. I'm going to play with my friends outside. I'm playing here doing this. Your energy expenditure is through the roof relative to once you graduate college and you get your first job and now you're sitting on your ass all day long. That's a complete change
It
of
literally,
environment.
yeah, of course.
Okay. And then let's say that you get married and you have a partner who you're going to behave that same way with. Oh, things get much worse then. Okay. So you can change these things. You really can. If you see individuals who maintain an active lifestyle throughout, you don't see a big change in their metabolic rate.
Right.
And if you do see people who have a change in their metabolic rate, they can change that metabolic rate with a combination of diet and exercise.
Most definitely. I have to tell you, this was a masterclass in this information, which is what I was hoping it would be. So just
Good.
giving
Glad to
people
hear
great
it.
information, excellent book, easy read. And I love the title Exercise Ain't Enough because I think for too long, especially in people who exercise regularly. They use exercise as the crutch to do whatever they want in other
Mhm.
areas. And the reality is it just doesn't work
It doesn't work.
like that. So thank you for writing something that you enjoyed writing and reading
Absolutely.
yourself for that. So again, I would love for you have been on before, but it's always good to tell people where they can learn more about
Sure.
Dr. Alexander.
Like you said, the book, it's a short, punchy read. It's just maybe 150 pages. So you can roll right through it very quickly. You can find it on Amazon, and you can also find it on my website, which is goodegg.fitness. So OODFITNESS. I'm all over the place. GODEGG.fitness. Go to there and you can find all my books and all the podcasts I've been on, including the last one I was on with you. And this one will be on there next.
Awesome. Alexander, you're awesome. Thank you so much for being on again. I appreciate you.
I'm so happy to be here anytime.